Lion begs, gorilla for help. You won't believe what happened next. A lion's anguished roar echoed across the Serengeti. It was not the proud call of dominance, but a cry of desperation, a mother's plea that pierced the morning calm. In the branches of a dead acacia tree, a massive rock python had coiled itself around her tiny cub. Its golden fur pressed tight against crushing scales. The lioness circled below, eyes blazing, muscles trembling, yet powerless to climb and save her young. Each second, the cub's struggles grew weaker, its breath fading. The savanna, usually alive with bird song and rustling grass, seemed to hold its breath, suspended in silence. And then, the impossible happened. From the distant shadows, a figure emerged towering, powerful, yet utterly unexpected. A silverback gorilla, far from any forest it should call home, began to move with deliberate steps toward the tree. Predator, prey, and stranger were about to collide in a moment that defied nature itself. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Serengeti as Edmund Cole adjusted his weathered camera strap and settled beneath the sparse shade of an acacia tree. At 73, his joints protested every movement, but his eyes remained sharp as the day he first picked up a camera 50 years ago. The golden light filtering through the dry grass created patterns that danced before his lens, each one a potential masterpiece waiting to be captured. The air carried the familiar scent of dust and dried vegetation, punctuated by the distant calls of weaver birds constructing their intricate nests in the thorny branches above. Edmund had spent decades documenting the raw beauty and brutal honesty of African wildlife. His photographs had graced the covers of National Geographic, adorned museum walls, and inspired countless young photographers to follow in his footsteps. Yet as he sat there, watching the endless expanse of grassland stretch toward the horizon, he felt the weight of time pressing upon his shoulders like a familiar companion. The morning had started like countless others. Edmund had risen before dawn, loaded his equipment into the battered Land Rover that had served him faithfully for over 2 decades, and driven deep into the heart of the reserve. He sought moments of quiet solitude, times when the natural world revealed its secrets to those patient enough to wait and observe. The photography was secondary to the experience itself, the privilege of witnessing life in its purest, most unfiltered form. A gentle breeze stirred the grass around him, carrying with it the subtle sounds of the savanna awakening. Somewhere in the distance, a ground hornbill called to its mate, while the soft rustle of small creatures moving through the undergrowth created a constant backdrop of life. Edmund closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself to simply exist in this space between civilization and wilderness, between the man he had been and the legacy he would leave behind. The tranquility shattered without warning. A roar pierced the morning air, not the proud, territorial call of a dominant lion, but something altogether different. This sound carried within it the raw emotion of desperation, a mother's anguish that transcended species barriers. Edmund's eyes snapped open, his photographer's instincts immediately alert. His weathered hands, still steady despite his age, reached for his camera with practiced efficiency. Through the telephoto lens, the scene that emerged defied everything Edmund thought he understood about the natural order. A massive rock python, its muscular body as thick as a man's torso, had coiled itself around a lion cub high in the branches of a dead tree. The serpent's scales gleamed dully in the morning light, each movement deliberate and methodical as it slowly constricted its helpless prey. The young lion, no more than a few months old, struggled feebly against the crushing embrace, its golden fur matted with saliva and blood. Below the tree, a lioness paced frantically, her powerful frame trembling with barely contained fury and helplessness. Her roars continued to tear through the air, each one a desperate plea for intervention from a universe that seemed deaf to her suffering. Edmund could see the intelligence in her amber eyes, the maternal bond that drove her to circle the base of the tree again and again, searching for some impossible way to reach her trapped offspring. The photographer's hands trembled as he focused the lens, his professional instincts warring with his human emotions. He had witnessed countless scenes of predation during his career. It was, after all, the fundamental reality of life in the wild. Yet something about this particular moment felt different, charged with an energy that made the very air seem to vibrate with tension. Edmund pressed the shutter release. The mechanical click barely audible above the lioness's continued roars. Through the viewfinder, he watched as the python adjusted its grip, each movement bringing the cub closer to death. The small cat's breathing had become labored, its struggles growing weaker with each passing second. The lioness below seemed to sense her child's fading strength, her calls becoming more frantic, more desperate. The clouds shifted overhead, casting the entire scene in shadow. The golden warmth of the morning gave way to something cooler, more ominous. Edmund felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the change in temperature. He lowered his camera for a moment, studying the tableau before him with his naked eye, trying to understand why this particular scene felt so significant. As he watched, the lioness suddenly stopped her pacing. Her head turned sharply toward a cluster of trees, perhaps 50 yards away. Her ears pricked forward in intense concentration. Edmund followed her gaze but saw nothing unusual, just the typical scrubland vegetation that dotted this part of the Serengeti. Yet the lioness remained focused on that spot, her body language shifting from frantic desperation to something resembling hope. Then Edmund saw it. Emerging from the shadows of the distant trees, a massive silverback gorilla moved with deliberate purpose across the open ground. Edmund blinked hard, certain that exhaustion and emotional stress had conjured this impossible vision. Gorillas belonged in the dense forests of Central and Eastern Africa, not here in the open grasslands of Tanzania. Yet, as the creature drew closer, there could be no doubt about what Edmund was seeing. The gorilla stood nearly 6 feet tall, its muscular frame covered in coarse black hair that seemed to absorb the filtered sunlight. Its face, framed by the distinctive silver saddle that marked it as a mature male, bore an expression of calm intelligence. Most remarkably, its dark eyes were fixed, not on Edmund or the surrounding landscape, but on the desperate scene playing out in the tree above. Edmund raised his camera again, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. Every instinct told him this was impossible, yet the evidence continued to unfold before his lens. The gorilla approached the base of the tree with unhurried steps, its gaze moving between the struggling cub above and the lioness below. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, predator and primate regarded each other across the vast evolutionary gulf that separated their species. What passed between them in that instant defied scientific explanation. The lioness, who should have seen the gorilla as either threat or irrelevance, instead seemed to recognize something profound in the great ape's presence. Her roars shifted in tone, becoming less frantic and more communicative. She moved closer to the tree's base, positioning herself directly beneath her trapped cub, and looked up at the gorilla with what could only be described as a plea for assistance. The gorilla responded by placing one massive hand against the tree's trunk, testing its stability. The dead acacia swayed slightly under the pressure, but held firm. Without hesitation, the silverback began to climb, his powerful arms and legs finding purchase on the rough bark with surprising agility for such a large creature. Edmund's camera clicked rapidly as he documented each moment of the impossible ascent. The gorilla's movements were deliberate and careful, clearly aware that too much disturbance might cause the python to tighten its grip or even cause both predator and prey to fall. Below, the lioness continued her encouraging calls, pacing back and forth but maintaining her position beneath the tree, ready to catch her cub should it fall. As the gorilla reached the level of the struggling pair, the python became aware of this new threat. The serpent's head swiveled toward the approaching ape, tongue flicking out to taste the air, assessing this unexpected development. For a moment, and the deadly tableau held perfectly still, gorilla, python, and dying cub, suspended in a balance that could tip toward salvation or tragedy with the slightest movement. The gorilla extended one arm toward the python, not aggressively, but with the same careful deliberation it had shown throughout its climb. The snake's coils shifted slightly, loosening just enough to allow the cub to draw a deeper breath. Edmund held his own breath, afraid that even the sound of his exhalation might disturb this delicate negotiation between species. What happened next unfolded with a speed that belied the careful buildup of tension. The python, perhaps recognizing that it was outmatched, began to unwind its coils from around the cub. The gorilla assisted this process, gently but firmly encouraging the serpent to release its hold. Within moments, the young lion was free, dropping toward the ground in a tangle of limbs and fur. The lioness was there instantly, and her powerful jaws closing gently around her cub's scruff as she caught it in midair. Mother and child tumbled together onto the dusty ground, the lioness immediately beginning the urgent process of cleaning and examining her rescued offspring. The cub, though weak and traumatized, it showed clear signs of life, its breathing steady, its eyes alert and responsive. High above, the gorilla and python completed their strange negotiation. The snake, its prey lost, slowly unwound itself from the branch and began its own descent down the opposite side of the tree. The great ape watched it go, making no move to pursue or threaten the serpent further. Once the python had disappeared into the undergrowth, the gorilla began its own careful descent. Edmund continued photographing throughout this extraordinary sequence, his professional training overriding his amazement. He captured the moment of the cub's release, the lioness's leap to catch her falling child, the tender reunion on the ground below. Most remarkably, he documented the brief exchange between lioness and gorilla as the great ape reached the base of the tree. The two creatures faced each other for perhaps 30 seconds, a lifetime in the rapid pace of wild animal interactions. The lioness, still cradling her cub, looked directly into the gorilla's eyes. What passed between them transcended species, transcended the usual predator-prey relationships that govern life on the savanna. It was recognition, gratitude, and something approaching friendship. The gorilla then turned and began walking back toward the distant trees from which it had emerged. Its pace was unhurried, dignified, as if this extraordinary act of interspecies cooperation was simply another part of its daily routine. The lioness watched it go, her golden eyes following the great ape's retreat until it disappeared once again into the shadows of the scrubland. Edmund lowered his camera, his hands shaking with a combination of adrenaline and emotion. In 5 decades of wildlife photography, he had witnessed countless moments of natural drama, hunts successful and failed, territorial battles, mating rituals, and the endless cycle of life and death that defined existence in the wild. Yet nothing had prepared him for what he had just experienced. The lioness continued to groom her cub, her rough tongue working methodically to clean the saliva and debris from its fur. The young lion, though clearly weakened by its ordeal, showed remarkable resilience. It attempted to nurse, drawing comfort and strength from its mother's presence. The deep gouges left by the python's teeth would heal, but Edmund suspected the psychological bond between mother and child had been strengthened immeasurably by their shared trauma and miraculous salvation. As the immediate drama subsided, Edmund became aware once again of the broader landscape around him. The sun had climbed higher in the sky, burning off the morning coolness and beginning to assert the fierce heat that would dominate the day. Birds resumed their calls. Insects buzzed among the scattered flowers that dotted the grassland, and life continued its eternal rhythm. Yet something fundamental had shifted in Edmund's understanding of the natural world. He had always respected the intelligence and emotional complexity of the animals he photographed. But this encounter had revealed depths of cooperation and empathy that challenged conventional scientific wisdom. The gorilla's intervention had been deliberate, compassionate, and utterly inexplicable within the framework of evolutionary biology as he understood it. Edmund spent the remainder of the morning at a respectful distance, documenting the lioness and her cub as they recovered from their ordeal. The young lion gradually regained its strength, eventually attempting to walk on unsteady legs while its mother maintained a protective vigil. By midday, when the heat became too intense for comfortable photography, both mother and cub appeared to be recovering well from their traumatic experience. As Edmund packed his equipment and prepared to return to his camp, he found himself repeatedly glancing toward the distant trees where the gorilla had disappeared. Part of him wondered if the entire encounter had been some sort of hallucination brought on by heat and exhaustion. Yet the images in his camera told a different story, providing tangible evidence of one of the most extraordinary wildlife encounters ever documented. The drive back to camp passed in a blur of dust and contemplation. Edmund's mind raced with questions that seemed to have no answers. How had a mountain gorilla come to be in the Serengeti? What had motivated it to intervene in a situation that offered no clear benefit to itself? Most puzzling of all, how had it seemed to understand the lioness's desperate need for help? That evening, as Edmund reviewed the day's photographs on his laptop, the full impact of what he had witnessed began to sink in. The images were technically perfect, sharp focus, excellent composition, dramatic lighting that captured both the tension of the moment and the profound emotion of the participants. More than that, they told a story that would challenge everything the scientific community thought it knew about animal behavior and interspecies relationships. Edmund selected his favorite image from the sequence, the moment when the lioness looked up at the gorilla with obvious gratitude and recognition. In that single frame, he had captured something that transcended the usual boundaries between predator and prey, between competing species, between the civilized world and the wild. It was, he realized, the photograph he had been searching for throughout his entire career. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity as Edmund prepared for what he had already decided would be his final exhibition. The story of the lion, the gorilla, and the python spread rapidly through social media and news outlets, capturing the imagination of people around the world. Wildlife experts struggled to explain the gorilla's presence in the Serengeti, with theories ranging from climate-driven habitat shifts to an escaped captive animal. Edmund found himself in constant demand for interviews and lectures, but he remained focused on preparing for the exhibition that would serve as his professional legacy. The centerpiece would be the photograph of the lioness's grateful gaze, surrounded by the complete sequence of images that documented the entire extraordinary encounter. The exhibition opened 6 months later in a prestigious New York gallery, drawing crowds that included not only art lovers and photography enthusiasts, but also scientists, conservationists, and anyone who had been touched by the story of interspecies cooperation in the African wilderness. Edmund titled the collection Beyond Instinct, reflecting his belief that the encounter had revealed capacities for empathy and cooperation that exceeded simple evolutionary programming. Standing before his final masterpiece on opening night, Edmund reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The photograph seemed to contain within its borders all the wonder, mystery, and profound beauty he had encountered during his decades in the wild. The lioness's eyes, filled with gratitude and intelligence, seemed to speak directly to viewers, challenging them to reconsider their assumptions about the emotional lives of animals. Critics praised the technical excellence of the photographs, but it was their emotional impact that truly resonated with audiences. The image of the grateful lioness became an icon of hope, a symbol of the possibility for cooperation and compassion even in the harsh realities of the natural world. Environmental organizations used it to promote conservation efforts, while educators incorporated it into curricula designed to foster greater respect for wildlife and natural habitats. Years passed, and Edmund's health began to decline, yet he remained deeply connected to the African wilderness that had defined his life and career. When the opportunity arose for one final journey to the Serengeti, he seized it despite the protests of his family and doctors. The physical demands of wildlife photography were beyond him now, but he felt compelled to return to the place where he had experienced his greatest triumph as both artist and witness to natural wonder. The landscape had changed in subtle ways during his absence. Climate shifts had altered vegetation patterns. Human encroachment had modified animal migration routes, and the ever-present pressure of development continued to shrink the boundaries of truly wild spaces. Yet the essential character of the savanna remained unchanged. The golden light, the vast horizons, the sense of being in a place where life existed according to its own ancient rhythms. Edmund's final photographs were gentler than his earlier work, reflecting both his advanced age and his evolved perspective on the relationship between humanity and nature. He no longer sought dramatic predation scenes or moments of high tension. Instead, he focused on quiet instances of natural beauty, a elephant family sharing water at a drought-diminished pond, zebra foals taking their first tentative steps, the intricate patterns created by wind-blown grass. On his last afternoon in the field, Edmund positioned himself near the same acacia tree where he had witnessed the miraculous encounter years earlier. The tree had aged along with him, its branches more gnarled and weathered, but it remained standing as a silent witness to the wonders it had once supported. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the grassland in shades of gold and amber, a movement in the distance caught Edmund's attention. A pride of lions was moving across the open plain, their sleek forms rippling through the tall grass like living shadows. At their head walked a magnificent male, his mane full and dark, his bearing confident and regal. Something about the lion's movement, the intelligence in its amber eyes, stirred a memory in Edmund's aging mind. Could this be the same cub he had watched being rescued from the python's coils so many years ago? The timeline seemed right, and there was something in the animal's bearing that suggested a creature that had experienced both vulnerability and salvation. Edmund raised his camera one final time, capturing the image of the lion leading his pride across the same ground where his life had once hung in the balance. In that moment, the photographer felt a profound sense of completion, as if the circle of his professional life had been perfectly closed. The young cub had survived, thrived, and taken his place in the natural order, a living testament to the power of compassion to triumph over the harsh realities of natural selection. The magnificent lion paused in his stride, turning his massive head toward Edmund's position. For an instant that seemed to stretch beyond time, their eyes met across the golden expanse of grass. In that gaze, Edmund recognized something profound, not just the intelligence common to all great predators, but a deeper wisdom that spoke of experiences beyond the ordinary. The lion's expression held a gravity that seemed to acknowledge their shared history, a silent recognition of the miracle that had shaped both their destinies. The pride continued their procession across the savannah, the adult lion occasionally glancing back toward Edmund's location. Other members of the group followed their leader, several lionesses, adolescent cubs, and younger adults who moved with the fluid grace that marked them as apex predators. Yet there was something different about this pride, a cohesion and mutual care that seemed to transcend typical feline social structures. Edmund watched through his lens as one of the lionesses approached the dominant male, rubbing against his shoulder in a gesture of affection and respect. The interaction reminded him powerfully of that long-ago moment when the rescued cub's mother had looked up at the departing gorilla with such profound gratitude. Perhaps, Edmund thought, experiences of salvation leave permanent marks on those who survive them, shaping not just individual behavior, but the very fabric of family and community relationships. As the pride moved farther into the distance, Edmund noticed something that made his breath catch in his throat. High above the lions, a dark shape circled slowly, not a vulture or other scavenger, but something larger and more deliberate in its movements. Through his telephoto lens, he could just make out the distinctive silhouette of a large bird of prey, possibly a martial eagle. Following the pride's progress across the plain, the sight triggered another memory, this one fainter but no less significant. In the weeks following the miraculous rescue, Edmund had returned repeatedly to the same area, hoping to document the recovery of both the lioness and her cub. During one of those visits, he had noticed unusual bird activity around the pride's hunting grounds, raptors that seemed to maintain a protective watch over the lions, intervening when other scavengers approached too closely to kills. Local Maasai guides had mentioned such phenomena in hushed tones, speaking of ancient bonds between species that most outsiders would dismiss as superstition. Yet Edmund had begun to wonder if the gorilla's intervention had somehow triggered a broader network of interspecies cooperation, creating ripple effects that continued to manifest years after the original miracle. The scientific community had never fully accepted Edmund's account of the gorilla's presence in the Serengeti. Despite the photographic evidence, many experts remained convinced that the images showed an escaped zoo animal, or perhaps a previously unknown population of eastern gorillas that had somehow migrated far from their usual habitat. Some critics suggested that Edmund had digitally manipulated the photographs, creating a fictional narrative to cap his distinguished career. These skeptics had never succeeded in fully discrediting the images. However, independent analysis by multiple forensic experts had confirmed their authenticity, while satellite imagery of the region during the relevant time period showed no evidence of nearby research facilities or zoological institutions from which a gorilla might have escaped. The mystery had only deepened with time, becoming the subject of academic papers, documentary films, and countless online discussions. Edmund had long since stopped trying to convince doubters, The truth of what he had witnessed lived not in scientific validation, but in the deeper understanding it had brought him about the interconnectedness of all life. The photograph of the grateful lioness had become more than just an image. It was a window into possibilities that stretched beyond conventional knowledge, a testament to the fact that nature still held secrets that human understanding had barely begun to fathom. As the sun continued its descent toward the horizon, casting longer shadows across the grassland, Edmund reflected on the journey that had brought him full circle to this moment. His career had been built on capturing decisive moments, the split seconds when life and death hung in balance, when the fundamental dramas of existence played out before his lens. Yet none of those thousands of images had prepared him for a moment when the natural order itself seemed to bend toward compassion. The temperature began to drop as evening approached, and Edmund felt the familiar ache in his joints that reminded him of his advancing years. His hands, once rock-steady, even in the most challenging conditions, now trembled slightly as he adjusted his camera settings. The physical demands of wildlife photography had become increasingly difficult, but his passion for the work remained undiminished. As the last light faded from the sky, Edmund began the careful process of packing his equipment. Each lens, each filter, each memory card was handled with the reverence due to tools that had helped create a lifetime's worth of artistic achievement. The weight of the gear, once negligible, now felt substantial against his aging frame, but he carried it with pride, knowing that this final session had produced images worthy of his legacy. The drive back to his temporary camp passed in contemplative silence. The Land Rover's headlights cut through the growing darkness, illuminating the occasional pair of eyes that reflected back from the roadside vegetation. Night hunters were beginning to stir servals, caracals, and the smaller predators that ruled the darkness while the great cats rested. Edmund had always found the transition from day to night in the African wilderness to be one of nature's most profound passages, a daily reminder of the eternal cycles that governed all life. At camp, Edmund uploaded the day's images to his laptop, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency despite their slight tremor. The photograph of the lion pride appeared on his screen in all its golden glory, the magnificent male in the foreground, his family spread out behind him across the vast expanse of grass. But it was the lion's eyes that drew Edmund's attention, those amber depths that seemed to hold acknowledgement of shared experience. Edmund opened the file containing his most famous photograph, the image of the lioness looking up at the gorilla with such profound gratitude. Placing the two images side by side on his screen, he studied the connections between them, the same golden light, at the same timeless landscape, the same sense of witnessing something that transcended ordinary experience. Together, they told a story of survival, growth, and the enduring power of compassion to shape destinies across species boundaries. In the days that followed, as Edmund prepared to return to civilization, he found himself drawn repeatedly to these paired images. They represented the beginning and end of a narrative that had shaped not only his professional legacy, but his fundamental understanding of what it meant to be a witness to the natural world. The young cub, rescued through an impossible act of interspecies cooperation, had grown into a magnificent leader who carried within him the wisdom born of both vulnerability and salvation. The implications of this story continued to resonate through Edmund's final years. He established a foundation dedicated to studying and preserving examples of cooperative behavior between species, funding research projects that might have been dismissed as fringe science in earlier decades. Young scientists, inspired by his photographs and his willingness to challenge conventional thinking, and began documenting cases of interspecies cooperation that had previously been overlooked or misunderstood. One particularly promising research project focused on the role of trauma and rescue in shaping long-term animal behavior. Preliminary findings suggested that animals who experienced life-threatening situations, followed by unexpected salvation, showed increased propensity for cooperative behaviors later in life. The rescued lion cub, now a mature pride leader, became a central case study in this emerging field of research. Edmund's final exhibition, expanded to include the new photographs from his last Serengeti journey, toured major museums around the world for 3 years after his death. Visitors consistently reported being moved not just by the technical excellence of the images, but by the story they told about the possibility of transcending natural boundaries through acts of compassion and mutual aid. The exhibition catalog, published shortly before Edmund's passing, included essays by leading biologists, anthropologists, and philosophers who explored the broader implications of his work. These scholars argued that Edmund's photographs challenged fundamental assumptions about competition and cooperation in nature, suggesting that evolutionary success might depend as much on the capacity for empathy as on the ability to dominate or survive. Dr. Jane Okoye, a primatologist who had spent decades studying gorilla behavior, contributed an essay that attempted to explain the silverback's presence in the Serengeti. She proposed that climate change and habitat destruction had forced some gorilla populations to expand their ranges far beyond traditional territories, potentially explaining how an individual might have wandered so far from its usual forest habitat. More provocatively, she suggested that the gorilla's intervention might represent an emerging form of interspecies communication, a recognition of shared mammalian bonds that transcended evolutionary competition. Conservation organizations seized upon Edmund's story as a powerful tool for promoting wildlife protection efforts. The image of the grateful lioness became a symbol of hope in an era when extinction rates were accelerating and natural habitats faced unprecedented threats. Fundraising campaigns built around the photograph raised millions of dollars for African wildlife conservation, while educational programs used Edmund's story to teach children about the interconnectedness of all life. The Maasai communities living near the site of the original rescue began incorporating Edmund's story into their oral traditions, weaving it into ancient narratives about the spiritual connections between humans, animals, and the land itself. Elders spoke of the photographs as proof that the old ways of understanding nature, ways that recognize the consciousness and agency of all living beings, remain valid in an age of increasing technological sophistication. Years after Edmund's death, researchers using advanced tracking technology made a remarkable discovery. A population of eastern lowland gorillas, previously unknown to science, was identified in a remote region of the Democratic Republic of Congo, less than 300 miles from the Serengeti. Genetic analysis suggested that this population had been isolated from other gorilla groups for thousands of years, potentially representing a previously unknown subspecies with unique behavioral adaptations. More intriguingly, local reports from the region described unusual interactions between these gorillas and other species, including documented cases of great apes intervening to protect young animals from predators. While scientists remain cautious about drawing definitive conclusions, these findings lent credibility to Edmund's account and suggested that his famous photograph might have captured not an impossible anomaly, but an example of behavior that was simply unknown to Western science. The story of the lion, the gorilla, and the python became a cornerstone of emerging research into what scientists began calling compassionate conservation, an approach to wildlife protection that recognized the emotional and social complexity of animal communities. This new paradigm moved beyond traditional models of species management to embrace a more holistic understanding of ecosystem relationships and interspecies dependencies. Edmund Cole's legacy lived on, not just in his photographs, but in the questions they continued to raise about the nature of consciousness, empathy, and cooperation in the natural world. His willingness to document and share an impossible moment had opened doors to new ways of thinking about humanity's relationship with other species and the potential for building a more compassionate world. As researchers continue to study the implications of Edmund's work, his photographs serve as a reminder that the natural world still holds mysteries that challenge our understanding and inspire our imagination. The grateful eyes of a lioness, captured in a moment of impossible rescue, continue to speak to viewers across cultures and generations, carrying within them a message of hope that transcends the boundaries between species and the limitations of human knowledge. The final frame of Edmund's career had indeed become his greatest masterpiece, not just a technically excellent photograph, but a window into possibilities that stretch beyond conventional understanding. In capturing that moment when compassion triumphed over instinct, he had preserved evidence of something that science was only beginning to comprehend: the universal capacity for empathy that connects all living beings in the great web of existence. Nature always finds a way to surprise us. Just when we think we understand the rules of survival, the wild reveals moments that speak of something deeper: compassion, connection, and mysteries that science cannot fully explain. These are the stories that remind us that life is not only about competition, but also about empathy and unexpected bonds. When we listen closely, the natural world has so much to teach us about resilience, about courage, and about the quiet power of kindness. Each story carries a message that goes beyond the animals themselves. It speaks to us, challenges us, and inspires us to see the world with new eyes. That's why I share these extraordinary tales with you. Because they don't just belong to the wilderness, they belong to all of us who dare to wonder, to feel, and to believe in the magic of life. If you want to keep exploring stories that reveal the hidden heart of nature, then this is the place for you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, tap the notification bell, and share this video with those who need a little wonder in their day. Together, we'll continue uncovering the most moving, breathtaking, and unforgettable animal stories from around the world. Because somewhere out there, another incredible story is waiting, and I promise, you won't want to miss it.